Well, thank you very much, Kenzie. And I'm delighted to be here at Elon to speak about what I believe is one of the great challenges of our time. How to protect the global climate while at the same time providing safe, reliable, and affordable energy for all. I've actually spent more than 20 years working on this issue, and while the solution seems simple, just transition to a low-carbon economy, it is actually extremely complex. So I'm going to talk about where we are now in trying to meet this challenge, where we need to be, and how we might get there. Now, I usually begin my speeches with a bit of humor. I could, for example, talk about the permafrost, which is neither permanent nor frosty, or the rainforest, which may soon be neither rainy nor forested. But instead, since I'm going to spend some time talking about what we've done to try to meet this challenge, I'd like to begin with a quote from the poet T.S. Eliot. "The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless." So with that in mind, let's start with a few basic facts. The science is clear that the Earth is warming, and you can see the temperature record up there, and that the impacts will be significant and perhaps catastrophic. And you can see there a chart that shows you the difference between the human impacts, the human side of it, and the natural side of it. These impacts will be felt everywhere, including here in the United States. Rising sea levels, for example, that will inundate parts of our coasts. And remember that 40% of the US population lives on the shoreline, and many of the world's countries. It's been estimated that Bangladesh, which emits less than half of 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, will have about 17% of its land inundated by 2050 and will displace about 18 million people. I should add here that the slide of the east coast of the US is based on a roughly 3-foot sea level rise. But a paper published just this past month suggests that we might see a sea level rise of approximately 6 feet by 2100. If that were to come to pass, we would be talking about more than 1 million people having to relocate. Climate change will also result in declines in agricultural productivity affecting food supplies. And note the areas of the world that are colored orange and red that would be most significantly affected. And we will see more floods. This is the Texas flood of 2014. More extreme heat. This was the US temperature in March of 2016. And you can see the darker red areas where the heat is the more extreme. There will likely be more droughts. Here's California in March of 2016. And more extreme weather events. This is a map of US extreme weather events in 2015, each of which cost over $1 billion. Climate change is also a global issue, as the emissions that warm the planet can come from anywhere and everywhere. The biggest emitting nations today are China at 28%, the US at 16%, the EU at 10%, Russia 6%, India 6%, and Japan 4%. But if we look cumulatively, and this is important because carbon dioxide, the most significant greenhouse gas, can last in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, the countries most responsible are the US at 27%, the EU at 25%, China at 11%, Russia 8%, Japan 4%, and India 3%. Given that the gases that warm the planet can come from anywhere, and that the impacts can be felt everywhere, let's start by looking at the global response. The first serious attempt to address climate change came with the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. Ratified by 197 countries, this agreement went into effect in March of 1994, and now, more than 2 decades later, its influence is still potent. The goal of the 1992 convention is to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system, a goal that remained in place without additional elaboration for 17 years. It's only in 2009, in the Copenhagen Accord, and then again in the Cancun Agreement in 2010, that reference is made to the need to keep global temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius, that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial levels. And in Paris, in December of last year, the 2-degree target is reaffirmed with a further statement that the parties to the agreement should, quote, drive efforts to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Unfortunately, we haven't found a path to achieving that goal. The convention itself sets no binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions. It establishes that developed countries should take the lead in addressing climate change. Developed countries, as a group, were also tasked with the aim of stabilizing their greenhouse gas emissions at 1990 levels by the year 2000. They're the green ones on the slide. Developing countries, and they're the orange ones, are treated very differently. Their actions, which are undefined, depend on whether developed countries meet their commitments on financial resources and technology transfer. The convention goes on to state that developing country actions must, in any event, take into account that, and I'm going to quote, economic and social development and poverty eradication are the first and overriding priorities. By 1995, just after the convention went into effect, it was already clear that its aim was inadequate to prevent dangerous interference with the climate system, and that stricter controls were needed. A 2-year negotiation process ensued that resulted in the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and I was actually personally involved in this development of the Kyoto Protocol. The protocol establishes legally binding targets for each developed country. For the United States, it was 7% below 1990 levels for the 2008 to 2012 period, but it doesn't contain any targets for developing countries. The specific binding levels were internationally negotiated and ranged from 8% below 1990 levels for the EU to 10% above 1990 levels for Iceland. Implementation was left to individual countries, although the agreement offers considerable flexibility in how those targets can be met. 192 countries ratified the protocol, but the United States, which at that time was the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, did not ratify it. In large part because of the U.S. failure to ratify, and in part due to the complexities of the agreement itself, the protocol did not enter into force until 2005, with the targets to take effect in a first 2008 to 2012 commitment period. Without the world's largest emitter, and without any targets that reflected the growing emissions from the major developing countries, Kyoto implementation stumbled and then collapsed. Canada withdrew in 2011. A second commitment period was agreed in Doha in 2012, with the EU and its 28 member states and 8 other countries accepting binding targets. In addition to the US and Canada, Japan, New Zealand, and Russia had no targets. 59 countries accepted the Doha Amendment, but 144 were needed for it to enter into force. Of the countries with binding targets, only 7 ratified the amendment. But of course, it was obvious long before 2012 that the Kyoto Protocol was on life support. A serious attempt was made in 2009 in Copenhagen to reach an agreement that would expand and update Kyoto with binding limits for developed countries and a 2020 target date. But this effort did not succeed, in large part due to the inability of the United States to accept an agreement that would require the advice and consent of the Senate. Also at issue was the question of what should be asked or required of the major emitting developing countries, given their rapid economic and emissions growth. In Copenhagen, the United States argued that developing countries should also have commitments. But since neither the US nor the developing countries would accept commitments that were legally binding, a political framework called the Copenhagen Accord emerged from the negotiations at the last minute. The Accord shifts away from a system with legally binding targets for some, as in Kyoto, to one where all commitments are voluntary. Developed and developing countries are still treated differently, but the distinction is based on the type of commitment. Developed countries have targets. Developing countries specify the actions they will take. 16 developed countries submitted 2020 emission targets. 37 developing countries submitted mitigation actions. These characteristics found full voice in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Like the Copenhagen Accord, this hybrid agreement combines characteristics of both the Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. Pledges are voluntary, although both developed and developing countries have provided them. Financial and technical assistance are also not binding. There's no enforcement and there are no penalties, although reporting and updating of contributions at regularly scheduled intervals are requirements with legal force. As of the date of the agreement, more than 180 countries had made pledges. Yet even if all the pledges are met, and history suggests this may not be the case, the 2-degree goal, let alone 1.5 degrees, is not on the horizon. Combining the pledges results in a roughly 3.5 degrees Celsius or 6.3 degree Fahrenheit temperature rise over pre-industrial levels. Some have called the Paris Agreement a tale of lessons learned. Certainly the failures of Kyoto and Copenhagen strongly suggest that an agreement with binding targets by all the major emitters was not possible. The United States, with its inability to secure the advice and consent of the Senate, and China, with its unwillingness to commit to any legally binding regime, particularly without the United States, would have precluded such a deal. But this agreement did bring together the world community. At best, it can be seen as a step on a very long road to stabilization of the climate. Looking back on the 23-year history of international climate policy, it's easy to be cynical about its slow evolution, about the failure of the international system to deal effectively with a serious problem. International negotiations with the participation of 190-plus countries are difficult at best, and I can tell you that from personal experience. But in the case of an issue like climate change, reaching an agreement in which every country believes it has achieved a win is especially complex. The reality is that climate change is an issue that is driven by national economic conditions and priorities, and therefore by national politics. For this reason alone, it's easy to see why individual nations would want to set their own targets or commitments and wouldn't want to negotiate those commitments with other nations. It took 23 years for the international negotiating process to formally recognize this in the Paris Agreement. If individual nations are fully responsible for both setting and achieving the commitments they make, do they do so by establishing and executing national programs? Or is there a further devolution to the subnational level? Climate policy in the United States paralleled global climate policy, with its emphasis on voluntary programs designed at the federal level in the post-Rio, pre-Kyoto period. But as the international negotiations leading up to the Kyoto Protocol progressed, so did the debate on climate policy in the United States. While the United States government participated in and even could be seen as the primary architect of the Kyoto Protocol, opposition to any mandatory international agreement on climate change grew steadily, culminating in the passage of the Byrd-Hagel resolution in the Senate in July of 1997. The vote was 95-0. This resolution urged the president first not to sign any agreement that mandated greenhouse gas reductions for developed countries unless there were specific developing country commitments in the same compliance period, and second, not to sign any agreement that would result in serious harm to the U.S. economy. The administration did move forward with the Kyoto negotiations and did sign the Kyoto Protocol, even though it contained no specific developing country commitments. But knowing that it would not be ratified, it never sent the agreement to the Senate for its advice and consent, and the U.S. never became a party to the protocol. By 2000, Interest in national action on climate change emerged in the US Senate. Republican Senator John McCain and then Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman introduced climate change cap-and-trade legislation in the Senate in 2001, 2003, and 2005. It didn't come to a vote in 2001. In 2003, it was defeated 55 to 43. In 2005, 60 to 38. But it ushered in a short-lived period of bipartisan action to address climate change. In the 110th Congress, this is 2007, 2008, 5 bills were introduced in the Senate and 5 in the House. Although none of these bills came to a vote, it is worth noting that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama co-sponsored the McCain bill, even though all 3 were battling for the presidency. Also of note is the fact that 12 Republican senators went on record favoring mandatory curbs on greenhouse gases. Meanwhile, in 2006, a group of 22 businesses and 5 NGOs formed a coalition called the U.S. Climate Action Partnership. And I was very involved in this as well. And in January of 2009, issued a blueprint for national cap-and-trade legislation. This blueprint became the basis for the Waxman-Markey bill, a climate change cap-and-trade bill that passed the House in June 2009 by a vote of 219 to 212, with 8 Republican votes. The bill moved on to the Senate, where, for a variety of reasons, it never came up for a vote. And the reasons include increased partisanship in the Congress, a lack of concrete support from the Obama administration, general exhaustion after the passage of the stimulus, financial reforms, and the Affordable Care Act. Yet it was on the strength of the House vote that the Obama administration pledged a reduction of 17% below 2005 levels of greenhouse gases by 2020 in Copenhagen. After Copenhagen and the collapse of the effort to enact national climate change legislation, the Obama administration began a serious process to use its existing authorities to reduce greenhouse gases. In its pledge as part of the Paris Agreement, the United States said it intends to achieve a 26 to 28% reduction from 2005 levels of greenhouse gases by 2025. It hopes to meet this target with a combination of national regulatory measures, some of which will be implemented nationally and others by the states. The centerpiece of the submission is the Clean Power Plan, a program that is estimated to reduce total U.S. emissions by just over 17% below 2005 levels by 2025. The program sets individual state targets, but allows states great flexibility in how the target is reached. The rule issued by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in final form in 2015 was immediately challenged in court by 27 states and a number of industry groups. Those are the red states. Meanwhile, 18 blue states issued a brief supporting the rule. But both its survival and its schedule for implementation are up in the air. The Supreme Court ruled in February that the rules should neither be implemented nor enforced until the High Court itself has heard the case presented by the rule's opponents. The Court of Appeals will hear the case in June and in all likelihood issue an opinion in early 2017. This opinion will almost certainly be appealed, and the Supreme Court will then have its say. In the original rule, states were to submit their plans for meeting their targets by 2018 at the latest, but because of the action by the court, the state is likely to be pushed back. Exactly what this will mean is somewhat unclear. 16 states are continuing to plan for implementation of the rule. 12 states have suspended planning efforts, including North Carolina. And 14 states have either made no announcement or have indicated that they're reviewing their options. So while it is clear that the ability of the U.S. to meet the 7% goal from this particular rule by 2025 will be affected, by how much is anyone's guess at the moment. Other national programs pursued by the administration do not rely on the states. These include measures to reduce hydrofluorocarbons and the heavy-duty truck rules. But even if all these efforts are successful, and taking into account the reductions that have already occurred as a result of switching from coal to gas in the electricity sector, increased use of renewable energy, improved vehicle efficiency, and no growth in electricity demand, the reductions from 2005 levels will range from 16 to 20% by 2025. How then will the United States meet the target it put forward in Paris of a 26 to 28% reduction? Some of this gap could be filled with improved energy efficiency, land use changes, and fuel switching in the industrial sector. But given that the chances of major additional actions at the federal level are small because of a divided Congress and the need to rely on executive orders and existing authority, reliance on the states will only continue to grow. How have the states performed to date? The states were very active during the period between the Kyoto Protocol, 1997, and the Copenhagen Accord, 2009. Many saw the U.S. failure to ratify the protocol, coupled with a policy of doing little at the federal level, as both an opportunity and, in some cases, an obligation to move forward at the state level. 18 states have greenhouse gas reduction targets, although they vary on base years, between 1990 and 2006, and ultimate dates, 2020 to 2050. For example, New York has a target of an 80% reduction below 1990 levels by 2050. California's target is to reach 1990 levels by 2020. But it's important to note that many of these targets were established by executive order of the governor, and many of the governors that established these goals are no longer in office. Also important to note is the fact that 10 states account for nearly 50% of all U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Of these, 5 have targets, and only 2, California and New York, have governors that have a strong commitment to addressing climate change. More important has been the effort states have put into shifting toward cleaner energy. 28 states, plus the District of Columbia, have renewable portfolio standards that require that a certain percentage of electricity used by the state come from renewable sources. A number of these states have already met their requirements and are considering increasing the standard. Several states have seen challenges to their standards, and one, West Virginia, has repealed its program. But there is no question that these requirements, particularly when coupled with tax credits for renewables enacted at the federal level, have been successful in lowering the cost of wind and solar energy and spurring their growth. Are there likely to be increased state efforts to fill the gap between existing programs and the U.S. pledge? Anything is possible, and I'm not particularly good at predicting the future, but I think the odds are slim that the target will be met. So what can we conclude about global and national policy efforts to address climate change? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, issued its first assessment in 1990, initiating a process that led to the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. In the 25 years since that assessment, and even though the science has become clearer and clearer on both the causes and impacts of climate change, global CO2 emissions have increased by approximately 50%. The International Energy Agency, in its central climate change case, sees energy-related CO2 emissions continuing to grow, although far more slowly. They predict that emissions would be 16% higher in 2040 than in 2013. Of course, some argue that absent international and national efforts and policies, emissions would be higher, and that is almost certainly true. Others argue that complex issues often take decades before they're resolved, and there's a lot of evidence for that. But no one can argue that our climate change policy has been a success. Humility should be the order of the day. Still, as we look forward, we need to look beyond purely government policy solutions. The reality is that meaningful global agreements are increasingly hard to come by, and national actions in the United States and elsewhere are often stymied by dysfunctional governments that have neither the will nor the means to act comprehensively and decisively. A broader look does give some reasons for cautious optimism. Increasingly, targeted citizen activism has begun to influence the actions of governments at all levels, and perhaps more importantly, advances in technology have begun to have a real impact on our greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at citizen activism, there are two campaigns that stand out: the effort to oppose construction of the Keystone Pipeline and the Beyond Coal campaign. Keystone first. In November of 2015, President Obama announced that after a 7-year review process, he would reject the request to build the Keystone Pipeline. He cited climate change as his reason for the denial and indicated that the pipeline had occupied what he called, quote, an overinflated role in our political discourse. In fact, the entire pipeline issue was largely symbolic, with exaggerated claims from the proponents of the pipeline saying it would be a boon for the economy, and the opponents saying it would be a climate disaster. The reality is that if there is sufficient demand for oil from the Canadian tar sands, which now there is not, it will find its way into the United States, if not by pipeline, then by rail. But the environmental community, a key constituency of the Obama administration, made rejection of the pipeline a major focus, with marches and rallies in front of the White House and across the country. So while the environmental benefits are small at best, there's no question that citizen action influenced the final decision. In contrast, the Beyond Coal campaign has targeted coal-fired power plants, the largest single source of carbon emissions in the United States. Led by the Sierra Club and with ample funding from Bloomberg Philanthropies, the campaign follows two strategies. It works at the grassroots level to build opposition to both new and existing coal-burning plants with traditional air pollution and not in my backyard arguments. But more important, it works through the state regulatory process by making the argument that shutting down these plants will actually save money. In these efforts, it hasn't been fighting alone. The price of renewable energy and natural gas have come down dramatically at the same time as the price of coal has increased, due in large part to traditional air pollution regulations that have targeted coal-fired power plants. Significant users of electricity in the business community are therefore also allies as they search for lower electricity prices. The results of this campaign, combined with policy and regulatory effects from EPA and fuel price reductions for alternative energy sources, have led to dramatic changes in the electricity system of the United States. Coal, which supplied 50% of U.S. electricity in 2005, supplied just 34% in 2015. In November of 2015, coal share had fallen to 29%. Again, while the work of activists can't be credited with the transformation of the energy system, it has clearly played an important role in this ongoing transition. If activism on the environment provides one glimmer of hope, the advance of technology clearly provides another. The steady improvement in and declining cost of low-carbon technologies is expected to continue over the next decades, transforming our electricity system. According to the International Energy Agency, renewables will overtake coal as the largest source of electricity by the early 2030s and will be approximately 50% of generation in the European Union, around 30% in China and Japan, and above 25% in the US and India by that time. Advanced energy is now a $1.4 trillion global industry, almost twice the size of the airline industry. But for the world to be on a path to 2 degrees or less, far more will be needed. There are two areas which need to be vigorously pursued. First, although coal burning is in decline in many parts of the world, plants that burn coal are still being built. The World Coal Association reports that 510 coal-fired power plants are under construction, with more than 1,800 in the planning stages. Of those in the planning stages, 450 are in India, more than 350 in China. A coal-fired plant has a useful life of greater than 40 years, and there is little chance that governments and companies will write off these investments. The only way we can contain their negative impact is through carbon capture and storage or reuse, or some other technology that prevents the carbon dioxide from being emitted into the atmosphere. We'll also need a similar technology to deal with the emissions from gas-fired plants, which are now being built in the US and in many other parts of the world. If government policy neither requires nor provides incentives to employ these technologies, there's little chance they'll be used and little chance of restraining climate change. Government action to deploy this technology is a must. Second, there is still much work to do to expand the use of renewables, particularly in the areas of transmission and storage. Great strides have been made in the ability to predict when power will be needed, thus enabling more efficient operations and greater use of wind and solar. And battery storage has also shown significant improvement. Growth in the deployment of renewables has been substantial, even in a world where fossil fuel prices have been low. But the 2-degree target or even a 3-degree target will remain elusive if we do not see technology improvements that will enable far greater deployment of renewable energy resources. The urgency of dealing with climate change cannot be overstated. 2015 was the hottest year on record, with ocean heat breaking all previous records. Of course, a strong El Niño pushed the temperatures up, but the temperature was much higher than in 1998 when there was a comparable El Niño. Devastating heat waves occurred in many places, including in the southern Indian states of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, where 2,000 people died. Marrakesh in Morocco saw 13 months of rain in 1 hour. Tropical cyclone Patricia hit Mexico City in October of 2015 as the strongest hurricane in either the Atlantic or eastern North Pacific, with sustained wind speeds of 215 miles per hour. The ethical issues raised by climate change should also spur an urgent response. The poor, both in the developed and the developing world, are disproportionately impacted by climate change. They will have fewer resources to adapt to a changing climate, and fewer resources to deal with the cost increases and job losses that are likely to occur, even if only on a transitional basis, as we shift to cleaner sources of energy. Consider the impacts of Hurricane Katrina. At the time of Katrina, the city of New Orleans had a population of approximately 500,000. 1/3 of that population lived below the poverty line. 112,000 did not have access to a car. When the order came to evacuate the city, those without cars had no ability to comply. So not only were there many of the homes destroyed, but they were personally at risk. There are still no accurate numbers on the number of dead from the hurricane, although estimates range from 1,000 to 2,000, with property damage estimated at $108 billion. Or consider the 2015 heat wave in Pakistan, where temperatures soared to as high as 120 degrees. More than 2,000 people died from dehydration and heat stroke during that period. It's not only the poor that should concern us. What of those who lose their jobs as we transition toward a cleaner energy future? On balance, this shift is likely to create more jobs than are lost, but they may not be in the same location, and those who lost their livelihoods may not be in a position to find alternative employment. What measures will we take to assure that opportunities are available or compensation is provided to those who are impacted negatively? There's also a basic issue of fairness. What of the countries who emit little, but for whom the consequences of climate change could be catastrophic? In 2012, the Alliance of Small Island States declared that, quote, climate change poses the most serious threat to our territorial integrity, viability, and survival. If sea level rise continues as predicted, residents of these island nations will have to leave their homelands. How can they be compensated for that loss, given that they played no role in creating the problem in the first place? Finally, we should also be concerned with future generations. While we are beginning to experience the impacts of climate change, future generations will be affected far more than we are. It's important that we ask whether we want to be the generation that provided future generations with a world that is more inhospitable than the one we inherited, where more people are at risk from hunger, where more people must leave their homes and livelihoods because of sea level rise, and where more people have less access to the fresh water they need to sustain life. So there we have it, 25 years. We articulated the goal and refined it. We tried many different avenues to achieve it, and we're still not on a path to get us there. You will forgive me, but as a student of English literature, I'm reminded again of another quote from T.S. Eliot. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Understanding where we are and where we must go is crucial, and our understanding has improved dramatically over the past 25 years. But this understanding has yet to be translated into effective action. It is clear that governments at all levels must make policy changes, that businesses must accelerate their efforts to provide the energy demand without the greenhouse gases current sources emit, and that citizens must continue and expand their efforts to hold both governments and businesses accountable for what they do and don't do to address climate change. But it's also clear that all of us have a role to play. Even if you don't want to spend all your time working toward a solution, there are 3 things you can do to make a difference. First, vote. The only way to have an effective strategy to deal with climate change is by having a president, a Congress, governors, and state legislators that accept the science and are committed to finding solutions. Of course, there are many issues at play when you make a choice at the ballot box, but climate change should be one of the top priorities. Second, many of us are in a position to make investment decisions. One easy way to make a dent in the struggle to address climate change is to invest only in those companies that are working towards solutions, and to specifically not invest in those whose only interest is in making sure no progress is made. There are many companies, both large and small, who are making internal operating decisions to shift toward clean energy and or to become more efficient and reduce their energy use, who are working to develop technologies that will put us on a path to a cleaner, greener future, and who support policies, both legislative and regulatory, national and global, that effectively address climate change. Just be sure to do your research carefully, as there are also many companies who talk the talk, but who do not necessarily walk the walk. And finally, the same research you might do on companies for investment purposes can also help you to make wise product and lifestyle choices. You can purchase an energy-efficient automobile, insulate your home, screw in an LED light bulb, eat less meat. None of your choices will by themselves solve the problem, but solutions to climate change have to come from both the bottom up and the top down. We all have to be engaged. The distance we have to go and the speed with which we must advance are daunting. Can we do it? Maybe. Whether we do or not is up to all of us.